Okay, let's go back into cognition one last time for the perceptual factors. Hopefully, I'll get through this fairly quickly. Uh, I want to look at how we actually think. So, we've already talked about the fact that our brains are actually made up of billions of neurons that are all connected. It's actually an associative memory system. So, you have, when a certain number of neurons are firing next to you, you'll get enough neurotransmitter to go across a chasm, across a synapse between the neurons, and if you have just enough threshold, this neuron fires, an electrical signal goes along the neuron and goes to the next. And then at the end of this neuron, so it slides along this neuron, and at the very end, neurotransmitters get released from that neuron that go to the next one. And since these neurons connect to multiple different neurons, what you end up getting is if you have enough of an activation from your neighbors, you'll be activated. And that sort of associative memory. And then, by the way, the neurons also grow in directions towards what has made them fire, or what the most recent neurotransmissions that have been happening. So essentially, you have a system that is based on a correlation between a particular thing, particular stimuli, and some other event. What this means, and then we also are predisposed for certain things like language, like visual processing, like our auditory sensors. But we spend a fairly large amount of time just recalibrating our senses, recalibrating our motor systems based off of these neurons constantly changing. It also means we have really terrible memories. Like, we think they're fantastic. They're pretty darn good for what they are, but they're not. Witness testimonies are painfully bad. We will fill in gaps in our memory on a regular basis and not know. That's the fun part of it. You will gladly and happily make up some stuff, filling in the blind spots, essentially, in your memory as you go. Okay, that's not the point of today's lesson or this part of the lecture, but I like to point that out, that people are not infallible. And in fact, you have to go out of your way to avoid screwing people up, and it's your job as a designer to make sure that people are doing the right thing. And it's too easy to screw around with people and make them come up with the wrong conclusions, giving them some kind of shape or some kind of graphic or data representation where they see things in the data that aren't actually there. You will find patterns when you don't want to, when you're not supposed to, which we looked at last time with Gestalt principles. Here is how we actually see things. So I have some stimuli coming in. This normally, we're talking about vision, but it could be auditory, it could be tactile, so touch. It could be olfactory, although that lasts longer, works slightly differently. But we have some kind of stimuli coming in, and then we have a short-term memory store for what we just experienced, that piece of music we just heard, that sight we just saw. It's very short-term. We then perceive, so short-term memory store, we have some very sort of idea of perception that we saw something. This is not just your neurons firing in your eyes, but that you are perceiving, you are making sense of what you're seeing. And then we make some kind of decision or make some kind of response. So we touch the stove, we feel that it's painful, we reject, well, that's a bad example. We hear a particular song we've heard before, we recognize the song, we have a response to it. We make a decision when something is coming at us to move out of the way. Okay. That then goes to what's called working memory. That's not a very long-term memory, but it is the things we're keeping in your head at once. Like if I tell you to remember 7 numbers in your head, or woman, man, person, camera, TV, that is working memory. The things you can keep in your head for a period of time. If you're watching this video a couple of years from now and reusing it, that's a Donald Trump quote, so you can look it up. It's a good laugh. Okay, besides that, so once I get to working memory, I also get long-term memory after that. So working memory is this is very much like your CPU, if you know your computer stuff, right? This is your central processing unit. It's just doing the calculations for you. Working memory is more like RAM, where you're storing your images, you're storing what's going on in the computer at that time. Long-term memory is your hard drive. This is where you're storing your large files. This video at the end will be stored on the hard drive. It's not kept in working memory. It's the more permanent solution. It's actually why we, unlike other animals, have this big wrinkly mass. Other animals have some wrinkles, but nothing compared to humans. It's really kind of shocking how wrinkly the tops of our heads are, because the outer part of our head is actually, at least as far as people are aware, and it may have changed since I did my psych degree, that is actually where they think most of your longer term memory is being stored. Your instinctual stuff is your inner rat brain, these little parts of your brain inside. The thing that makes us different is this wrinkly crap on the outside. And it's wrinkly to give you more neurons per square inch, that you can just pack them in there. Okay, we go to long-term memory, and that long-term memory, and your working memory, both influence your perception. So if you have had some traumatic experience in the past, you will see the world differently. If you had just seen a rabbit and they say, find the rabbit, or they tell you what to do, the task you are given, it will change your perception, what you actually attenuate to. That's one of the reasons we have certain things, that you can actually direct people's perception based off of what you're told to do, what the task is, or just giving some kind of hints of what you can look at. Then we have a response execution when you try and do something, and then some kind of feedback, and then you see what happens. So if my decision is to run out of the way of the oncoming lion, I then move my body away from the oncoming lion, and you hope that the stimuli is not you being eaten by a lion, but instead you see the lion running by the side of you. Okay, maybe lions are a bit more persistent than that. But this is for feature analysis, right? You're not perceiving this. You're not consciously choosing to see this. This is what your brain is going to do for visual processing, whether you want to or not. Motion is in this range. You don't choose to see motion. You can choose to try and not pay attention to it, but you're seeing it whether you want to or not. That's why it's so frustrating when you see things moving on the screen and you can't help it. Those little images when you get an ad when you go to a website and you get an ad and it just wiggles around just a bit. The reason it's so hard to turn away from it, the reason it's so horrible, is because you have to consciously put effort to tune it out. Okay, once I go to working memory, I got less than 30 seconds. I'm keeping 49 things. This is where the 7 plus or minus 2 bull poo line is. It's a rough rule of thumb. It is not something that you can generalize. It is not carved in stone. It didn't come down with Moses and the 10 Commandments. The 7 plus or minus 2 is the number of discrete items you're able to remember in your working memory at a time, according to the original research paper. The original author of that research paper disavows that research because people took it and ran with it so much. They made 7 plus or minus 2 for everything, even when it made no sense. So, approximately 7 things in working memory. Approximately. It's not hard. It's not set in stone. Working memory is more than 30 seconds. Hey, great. But since our neurons are built the way they are, because it's this associative memory system, it's ridiculously unreliable. So my favorite example I always give people is, and maybe I overdo it, when they were studying this for the first time, they asked a bunch of adults, American adults, if they remembered the bombing of Pearl Harbor. This would be about a time that 10 years from later, after Pearl Harbor, most people would remember that day. Just like, do you remember September 11th? If you were, I guess, my age, maybe you guys have a different term, a different horrible scarring memory where people died. They said, okay, do you remember Pearl Harbor? And they say, oh yeah, I remember, the Cubs were playing in the World Series, or whatever the case. I don't know who was playing the World Series at that time. They were playing in the World Series, and then so and so happened, and it was a bright sunny day, etc., etc. If anyone remembers when Pearl Harbor was struck by the Japanese, you'd remember that it happened in December, not when the World Series was happening. People fill in the gaps, and they're not lying. That's what's interesting. Their brain will fill in the gaps because that's the only way you keep yourself from going nuts. So you can't necessarily rely on your memory. It's okay, but you always have to take a step back and go, I could be wrong. If anything, hopefully this lecture teaches you, it's the benefit of humility, because you can be wrong. Okay. So it's up to 30 seconds or over 30 seconds. It's stored, permanently. It actually is not stored permanently. If you don't remember that memory that often, or something else needs those resources, you'll start losing that memory because those neurons will be used for other things. Okay. So there's a bunch of different theories on this. So for example, the dual coding theory. So this is the idea that verbal and visual information is coded differently. What I see and what I associate in terms of words and verbal structures are stored and encoded in a different way. And so I can see one thing associated with a particular word, despite the fact that they may be disconnected, and I will not know, or I'll remember it in different ways. Verbal working memory is different from visual working memory, and therefore you can have a lot of words on the screen, and that's not the same as what you visually take away from something. Visual working memory in particular, though, is controlled by attention. And attention is about 100 milliseconds. Which means if I'm trying to see things, if I'm trying to pick up little bits of information, I need to control the user's eye gaze. I need to control their attention, where they're focusing their eyes, where they're paying attention, for them to actually read my data correctly. I can't throw information at them. I need to guide their eyes into what's important. So a gist, by the way, is 100 milliseconds. Okay, so this is your attention changes every 100 milliseconds, maybe even faster for someone like me. But a gist is 100 milliseconds. This is how much you can take away from the image in 100 milliseconds. And this is not automatically fed into long-term memory. In fact, short-term to long-term memory, or working memory to long-term memory, is it's the hippocampus hippocampus? Yes, hippocampus that's doing this. Looks like a horse. That's why it's called the hippocampus. It's also the thing that got hurt in the if you've ever seen the movie Memento. That's the parts of the brain that got injured with that guy that couldn't keep long-term memory. It actually happens. There's something called Korsakoff syndrome. It's the thing I took away from my psych degree, caused by excessive alcohol use. That'll cause the exact same thing. It's quite hellacious to watch someone with that condition. Okay. I love Colin Ware. He's a really nice guy. I had dinner with his wife and stuff like that, but I'm still a complete and utter groupie of this guy. The power of visualization is that we have a far more complex concept structure represented externally in a visual display than can be held in visual and verbal working memory. That is something to ruminate on. What I'm trying to point out is what I talked to my son about, and he goes, yeah, and he's 8. And you would all go, yeah, and yet we don't take advantage, or we don't appreciate that fact. When I ask you to do a math problem would, add these 4 rather large numbers together, what do? You write it on a piece of paper. You don't do it in your head unless you're way smarter than me, right? Why do you write it on a piece of paper? Because you need to externalize those numbers rather than trying to keep them in working memory. We know it's problematic. That's why we write stuff down. That's why we doodle. And a visualization allows you to play with data without having to keep it in your head, without having to have a pie chart or a line graph and then have to think about, what was that other line graph that I saw earlier? To be able to keep a whole bunch of this information, or to compare things and not have to rely on working memory, is the huge benefit of this. That's what these tools give you. It allows you to focus in on the data and play with the data, move the data around without having to try and have people juggle things in their head. So, attention and visual search. When we're talking about a visual search, this affects your perception. The short term, you're picking this up anyways, but your perception itself is being affected by your working memory, your long-term memory, and your attention, and it actually changes how you view things. I'm not going to show this video. I strongly recommend it. It's a fun video about people playing basketball. Just have a look. I don't want to show videos of videos because it's quite shocking when you see it and you're like, what? Yeah, it's amazing. Okay, but let's try a static one. So the task we have here is to identify the lumps and nodules in a patient's lungs and look for cancer or abnormal growth. Okay, so I want you to look at this lung and see if you think are cancerous cells in there or some kind of abnormal growth. Now, what's really interesting about this is that 83% of the radiologists miss the gorilla. And you're probably wondering what the hell I'm talking about. That gorilla. Visual attention and change blindness. We miss a lot of stuff if we're not directing our attention. That's why I put a big red circle there. It grabbed your attention. There you go. That's where your eyes go. You're looking for differences of things. We are very bad at some tasks, like looking for minuscule things in a large pattern. And so paying attention to this and helping the user perceive what they need to perceive is the job when you're designing a visualization or when you're designing any kind of interface. And it doesn't have to be a visual interface. These skills and these particular traits are applicable for all of everything that we're designing. A gist, however, refers to the visual information perceived at a glance, about 100 milliseconds. And the weird thing is, some things are more easily acquired than others. So this is what they do. I love this particular study. They take a photo, they show the users a photo under 100 milliseconds, bling, and then they change the photo on the user. They keep the general structure of the scene and ask them if they've seen the photo out before. And people will see this particular scene here and then conclude that they've seen this scene before because they saw this picture right here. This to this, because the exact shape of the buildings and everything are the same. In the run of it, in that length of time, that's what you get with the gist, right? This wheat field down to a parking lot, just because the pattern of the cars in the wheat field versus the parking lot is the same, approximately. What makes some things more memorable, though, is what you're seeing here. The colored sections here are the things that are most memorable. This is what people see in like 100 milliseconds. And the number one thing we're good at, I know, very crazy, are people. Most memorable stuff. The least memorable stuff, I'm assuming, is like sky and anything blue. So this sky up here, no one's paying attention to it. This archway here, they're seeing the contours here a bit more. They're seeing the bed. That's the first thing that they see in this gist. They're seeing this shape right here. They're not seeing the trees here. They're not seeing the hill here. They're seeing the stream here. What we see really quickly are people. A person sitting is just slightly worse than that, I guess. Floors, seats, things you can use. Bedrooms, bakeries. In terms of actual places, bathrooms are much more noticeable and perceivable in 100 milliseconds in a bedroom, which I don't know if I should make any kind of conclusions based on that. But a campus is more noticeable than a broadleaf forest, for example. No, they're the same as a broadleaf forest. But these are things that are not as obvious, like a mountain, a tree. There's nothing that really makes things pop. We are sort of custom designed to see human faces. That's what we are good at. And so this is why our gists are so good at this. So how do we remember visualization? So this is actually another Michelle Borkin paper. When we talk very soon about chart junk, this is related to that chart junk talk. It's the visualization guidelines. So, and normally I do that one first before this. But the idea is that there's a big movement in the community. Oh my God, do not put chart junk. This here, gaudy, horrible thing, is chart junk. This is chart junk. There's pencils for no reason to have pencils. Why not have a bar chart? Why do you have this woman, I'm presuming, crying? I have no idea what that's all about, right? It's chart junk. Anything that is not needed in the visualization or in the graphic. Things that are not needed, strip it out. Why are you complicating things? Okay. And so that was sort of the gold standard is always to minimize everything that you have. So, but the weird thing is, these things kept popping up, and Michelle Borkin and the people in her lab kept on noticing that people still like chart junk, and it does seem to serve a purpose. So they looked at some eye tracking data. They had people look at, a scene or a visualization and saw where their eyes went. So here's the eye tracking data. Here's Michelle. So and they have an infrared camera, visualization on display. They have the eye tracking computer. They have the experimental computer. Fine. Here's what we encode in under 10 seconds seeing the image. The most memorable versus the least memorable. So they have 10 seconds this time. Okay. This is how people look at these various scenes. These are the most memorable images. Here's the least memorable images of this set. Okay. Notice the difference, right? I would assume the dinosaurs, things with big teeth, tend to be very memorable. Why? Because they tend to eat us. We tend to be on the lookout, right? Things with fancy, nice graphics or some evocative images, right? Versus the bar chart, pie graph, they're not that enticing. In terms of recognition, so we have memorability. In terms of recognition, these are the most recognizable images here, and the least recognized. So in terms of, we have whether we recall them later. Okay, that's what it is. So where you look when you recall them later, when you look at the image again later, and you say if you've seen it before. So you flash this up in front of us, and this is where the person looks. It's always sort of smack dab in the center where most of the activity goes. The least memorable things, your eyes are all over the place versus laser focus on the center point or a point of importance. We have visual associations with certain things, with certain shapes, with certain, with people, with certain icons. And over here in the least memorable, we have sort of semantic associations when things go up, when things get bigger versus, actual images, iconography. This is more like that stock went up, didn't it? Okay. So if we want visual associations, one of the things we can do for visual associations to help people is human recognizable objects. Even if it may not have to screw up your data, but you are more likely to remember it with a human recognizable object. And annotations and so the visualization or a plot, annotations and wording and things like that are extremely effective at getting people to remember what your visualization looks like, because it directs attention so quickly. Semantic associations are things like the title, the textual descriptions. That is semantic, or what the meaning of things, versus, visual associations, a line chart, a line graph going up. The line itself is a visual association. It is not a human recognizable object, but it is sort of indicating something visually. Semantic association is verbally based in this case, or what the underlying meaning for some things are. Labels, label axes, that sort of thing for semantic. And in terms of recall, here's where the total number of mentions when the person was, talking about something, what people talked about. Title, label, paragraph, data, legend, axes, all the way down, and the source. Oh, poor Wikipedia. The source where this information is coming from. Unfortunately for humanity, that is the least important or the least recalled thing out of everything we do. We'll gladly repeat misinformation, wrong information, or just listen to someone that makes up lies on a regular basis and still believe him or her. Annotations are not as obvious, but human recognizable objects, very, very good for recall comparatively. Notice that the title, label, and the paragraph, any kind of paragraph associated with it, all very good for recall. Meaning don't skimp on the text. Even if you don't want to put it in there, that title means a great deal in terms of people recalling and remembering your visualization. Good titles help. Things like election debate, not going to help that much, versus 66% of Americans feel Romney performed better than Obama in the debates. Right? Will you shut up, man? Says Biden in the debates, would be the more recent one, right? As maybe a title for this thing, right? Something that gets people's attention and keeps them there. We have, if we map this out on memorable, forgettable versus high quality and low quality, which is what they did, we get the following. For memorable stuff, we have a lot of shapes. We have things like human faces. We have a lot of text. It's memorable. It's very evocative. It may not be very dense in terms of the amount of data being conveyed. This is not particularly great, nor is this. But this is why, infographics are so effective, despite the fact they're not that well designed in at least in my opinion. Forgettable stuff, here is a low quality visualization or low quality graphic. Here's a higher quality graphic, but no one's remembering squat about this. I would say this is not particularly high quality, but no one's remembering this. Notice what we have. We're trying to get into that range here, where people remember it and they're getting the information across correctly. And that's an art form, but it involves, good titles, human recognizable objects, and good use of colors, control of the eye, so where people are focusing their attention, that sort of thing. You're trying to tell a story, and that involves structuring the narrative. So here's our effective thing. We have visual associations. We have semantic associations at the same time. So both verbal and visual. We have message redundancy, because people will miss it one time. If you have it in two different places, like you have a 14% and then you have the people there, that's a redundant piece of information here. It says US and it has the United States flag. Redundant information. And data redundancy. So the message, what you're trying to get across, that Norway is way better at something or other, female representation, both in the graph and in the text, is message redundancy. The data redundancy is something like Norway and the Norwegian flag. And titles and annotations make a difference. Human recognizable objects do not hinder visualization recall, it turns out. Fixation time, least of all the visual elements, but it's still kept. You don't have to focus your eyes on it. You pick it up right away, which is nice. And the recall descriptions are of higher quality. They recognize it without having to stare at it, which is really nice. And they can help your message. So if you take this bar chart, for example, if you want people to remember that it's China, Korea, Japan, and India about something or other, gender equality and labor force participation. If you put it down and just said the country names, it would not be remembered as much as having the images, the flags themselves as well. Visualizations, memorability is what we need for at a glance. Recall, titles and text are key, so do not skimp on them. Human recognizable objects help you recognize and recall things. And redundancy really helps you with understanding. Okay. And there's actually a whole lot of empirical evidence, including Michelle Borkin's 2015 paper. The big things, if you want to effectively communicate your message, is always to pick an appropriate type or plot of data, how you want to present it. Do not give me pie charts unless you really have to. Titles and text are key elements. Don't skimp. Redundancy is great if you can do it. Don't kill yourself, but that's something to think about. And human recognizable objects. And my word of warning is this. This is a Chernoff face. Do you believe it's Chernoff? Not Chekhov. Yeah, Chekhov's gun, Chernoff face. Okay. Chernoff faces were, if you do not design something and know what you're doing, or you just make assumptions about things, you get a Chernoff face. The Chernoff face was invented in the 1970s when a mathematician decided, or realize that humans are really good at recognizing faces. So the idea is, what if you can make a glyph, you make an element where you describe the attributes of that object or element. So you have an element with a bunch of attributes. Those attributes are mapped onto the general shape of a human face. So the size of the cheekbones, the length of the chin, the length of the nose, the width of the nose, the distance between the eyes, the height of the eyebrows, the size of the eyes. These are all things you can manipulate. If you can use those sort of descriptions of a human face and encode data with that, well, people would be fantastic at Chernoff faces then, because we're really good at recognizing faces. Notice the issue. Maybe you recognize the issue. And by the way, this, despite the fact that some of you might be annoyed or upset, is perhaps the only reasonably good use of a Chernoff face I've ever seen in my entire life. And yeah, you could definitely argue that it's not good, but it's better than every other use of Chernoff faces. Chernoff faces give you a horrible side effect, is that you see human faces. You do not see individual attributes. You see a human face. You cannot pull out what those attributes mean. Oh, the eye distance is greater on this one. Because you're so good at recognizing faces, you see it as a face, as a whole, not as individual attributes. And so people are terrible with Chernoff faces. They've been this, albatross around our neck as a community for forever. This particular graphic for Los Angeles is trying to show, unemployment rates, affluence, so how round the face is, how fat you are essentially, urban stress, so based on the eyebrows, and the proportion of the white population. So by making the Chernoff face less, yellow in this case, Simpsons white, I guess, by making the Chernoff face less white, making them look angrier because they're more stressed. By making the unemployment rate, if the unemployment rate is high, they're very sad, so it's a frowny face, and the amount of affluence, at least the dimensions are mapping to what you would expect those dimensions to map to. That if you are more affluent, you're going to have a rounder face. You will not be as skinny because you can eat. Again, that's a stretch, but that's the only use of a Chernoff face I've ever seen that sort of at least conveyed what they're trying to convey in an accurate way. You can see who the angriest, the worst off people in the entire city of Los Angeles in a second. I don't think it's a real big surprise for many of you who the most kicked around population in Los Angeles is, and that there are some systemic issues going on. This is Los Angeles in the 80s, but I don't think it's changed all that much, or anywhere, unfortunately. Okay, I'm going to come back next time. We're going to look, I think next up we're looking at visualization design principles and marks and channels. That's coming up soon. I'm going to try and make sure I may have too much lecture for the number of classes. Ignore the later ones if you need to, right? I'm okay with that. So next up, we're going to be talking about visualization design principles, marks and channels, and then later stuff is going to be interesting stuff about visualizations, but if you don't have time to get to some of the last lectures, it hopefully won't influence your projects. All right, thank you everyone, and I'll talk to you soon.